Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to talk about keep learning Torah, beware complacency. I'm pretty sure that for most of us, we consider ourselves Torah keepers, that we consider ourselves observers of the commands, and that we have our general understanding of what the Torah is and our understanding of individual commands. And of course, our observance, which is according to that understanding. That being the case, I'm pretty sure that we can also agree that we don't have 100% understanding of all of the Torah. That we don't know as much as we could know about the Torah. And I want us to consider, what is it that we think the Torah is? If the Torah is the instruction for how we are to live, if it is the way that Elohim wants us to serve Him and to love Him, if it is that which makes us right with Him, such as it says in Deuteronomy 6:25, if it is the way we are to pursue righteousness and pursue what is good and right in His sight and what is life instead of what is death, if it is all of those things, then how much of a priority should it be for us to continue learning it, to continue understanding it further, and to update our observance accordingly? For me personally, whenever I first got into observing the Torah, I got into observing around the same time that some of my friends were getting into it. And we spent many hours studying the text. We spent a lot of time looking into various scriptures. But it wasn't until a few years later that I realized we hadn't spent as much time studying the Torah as we could have. That we spent a lot of our focus on these prophecies and on trying to reconcile different messianic issues and trying to understand what the sort of grand narrative was behind all of these things. That even though we had our observance of the Torah, we had our understanding of what that would look like and what the commands were that we needed to do that we weren't doing before. Even though we had all of that and we considered ourselves Torah observers, we didn't really focus that much on studying it. And as mentioned, it was a few years later that I started realizing that I realized I needed to actually read through the Torah and read through it fully, something that I had not even done until a few years after I started observing. And around that time when I was reading, I started realizing I ended up missing some of the commands. I didn't even know there were certain commands in there that were. I had just never seen them because I never read just straight through it. And so it was at that time that I started realizing, I need to update my observance. That I didn't learn absolutely 100% of how to do things whenever I first got into it. That there is still more to learn, and that there are things to update my observance with. And I think this might be kind of a clue for us. That if we think back to whenever we first started observing, over maybe the first few weeks or maybe the first few months, we probably changed the way we were living in fairly significant ways. And considering that, we might consider our observance at that time compared with now. If our observance now looks a lot like it did back then, if it looks identical and we haven't updated anything since then, I think there may be a problem. And something to consider is that learning is not the accumulation of knowledge. We may have been reading and we may have been studying, but if our behavior hasn't changed, if our observance has not updated, we may not really be learning, because learning involves behavior change. So in recognizing how important the Torah is, and how much of a priority it is for us, because it's the way that we are living, it's the way that we are seeking to be right with Elohim. Considering that, what is it that we are supposed to do in a practical sense? Because the fact is, we are all very busy. We all fill our day already, and we have a lot of priorities and obligations. Priorities like family and career or a job or our business, and even just the menial chores of the day, they still have to be done. There are all kinds of obligations that we already have. So what are we supposed to do? I would suggest that we take a very small, manageable amount of time, even just down to 10-15 minutes. Putting aside that small piece of time every day. There's probably something that we do for 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day that we could replace with something as important as the Torah. There's probably something that may not be as important as the Torah that we could work that study into. And even just to start with, we may want to begin by going through a sequential reading, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and so forth, to make sure that we actually have read all the way through. And even if we have, to continue doing that. Because the fact is that we may have seen a command before, but it may not have actually gotten into the conscious part of our thinking. We may not have actually incorporated that into our observance or realized how to incorporate it into our observance. Or maybe there are commands that we are already seeking to observe that we had a previous way that we understood it, and maybe that's not actually what the text says. So the only hope that we have of realizing that, probably anyway, is to be reading through and making sure that we're actually reading the text for what it is. Being careful that we're not seeing our beliefs instead of seeing the wording of the text. And so a sequential reading is one way that we might arrive at that too, because our inclination is not going to be to study something we already think we know. And so going through like that could help us to realize some things that maybe we didn't understand them exactly according to the text before. And going beyond this, if you don't already have ISA 2 downloaded to your computer, Interlinear Scripture Analyzer 2, it is a free program available at scripture4all.org. That's scripture, the number 4all.org. If you don't already have that on your computer and you have a computer, then make sure that you get it. There's no reason not to have it. Using something like this that has a Hebrew concordance function, a program like ISA 2 or a book that's equivalent to it like Englishman's Hebrew Concordance, allows us to get a much better idea of what's going on in the text because we can actually cross-reference how a word is used in other contexts. So instead of relying upon a dictionary or relying upon a translation, we can get a much better idea of what's going on, or at least have the possibility of that. So I highly recommend that you check that out if you haven't already, and the link will be in the description box. And of course, it wouldn't hurt to have some physical copies of some books on hand as well if you're interested in that. There may be a reason at some point that we can't use a computer, and so you may want to have a Hebrew copy of the Torah, and it's probably going to be in the form of a Tanakh. But either way, having that in the Hebrew, having maybe a Hebrew lexicon or a book to learn Hebrew from. And of course, this doesn't mean that you have to do all of this at once or anything like that. But over time, as you have the time to do it, as you find the time to do it, you will be able to use this to increase your learning. And something to consider is that right now, obviously it's a priority for us individually. Thinking about yourself and your own observance and your own service of Elohim. Obviously, that is something that's important, but it could also go beyond that. Even though right now it may just affect you, in the future, there may be more people that start coming to the Torah. Situations could change very drastically and very suddenly, and this could be an unexpected turn that people are asking you how to observe. That maybe you are the only person that they know that is observing, and so that responsibility might fall on you to show these people what the Torah says. And so while we may not have considered it important to be an expert in the Torah just for our own observance, We may want to be an expert in the Torah in order to relay that information. We want to increase our understanding beyond just being able to repeat something we've heard before. We want to actually have that understanding so that we can provide the answers as they need to be. And so this is something to consider, because the situation right now may not be like that at all, and we may not expect that at all. But there is this concept of leaders of 10s, leaders of 50s, and so forth. And that may be a role that we have to fill in the future, even if we don't see it right now. Things could change. And so considering all of this, and considering how important that seeking to be right with Elohim is, I think we need to beware any kind of complacency that may have set in us at some point. And this doesn't just go for, people out there or anything. It also goes for me. It also goes for all of us. That there's probably always something more that we could be learning. And so I encourage us to continue our learning. That if we need to, incorporate in some more time, even just a small amount every single day. Because doing it consistently, making it a habit, that will result in us continuing our learning and updating our understanding, updating our observance. Thanks for watching, and remember the commands. Shalom.